Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really glad to have Professor Mark Nevitt here. We've known each other for what, 15 years, 20 years,
Yes,
more than that. Mark was in the Navy. He was an aviator, and then he saw the light and became a lawyer. And he has established himself. He actually knows a lot about a lot of different things, but he's established himself, for my money, the foremost lawyer, bar none, on the issue of environment and national security. And so I'm really glad that you could make it here, Mark. And I think you brought one of your students here.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Who's Mark's student?
Emory representing. Right.
Yeah, from Emory.
That's right.
Mark, I'm going to get out of your way. So.
Okay. Well, thank you, sir. Yeah, I think, oh my God, the voice of God. How is this happening? Yeah, I think that as an aviator, I by far have the highest carbon footprint of anyone in this audience. So part of my penance is to work on environmental issues for the rest of my life and present them to you in hopefully an understandable manner. And so my goal here today, it's a short burst. I'll talk for about 20, 30 minutes or so. My goal here today is try to present environmental law, climate change, and security, and present sort of 10 key takeaways. And I want to make the most skeptical person in this audience who's like, why is environmental law a security issue? Why is this guy talking, right? I want to make that most skeptical person come out at the end of this thinking to themselves, there's a lot here that I need to know about. So let me frame this in sort of 10 key takeaways, 10 characteristics of this growing field of environmental security and climate security. The first key takeaway is that federal environmental law is really complex and is growing in importance. This is my Tyrannosaurus Rex slide. And we have seen just an explosion in environmental law since 1969 and 1970 with the passage of the National Environmental Policy Act. The upshot is that most of these laws, and there's acronyms, I stopped writing the acronyms down around 2000, apply to federal agencies to include national security agencies and the Department of Defense as a co-equal federal agency under administrative law. And you better believe that environmental groups, many of whom I'm friends with, are very litigious and are watching the US Navy and the US Department of Defense very closely to make sure that we're not eaten alive by these these T-Rex laws. So my first takeaway is that they're growing in complexity, and for the most part, they apply to the Department of Defense and national security agencies as a co-equal federal agency. Okay, but wait, there's more. There are broad waivers of sovereign immunity within environmental law. This is one of the provisions of the Clean Water Act, one of the acronyms I had in that T-Rex slide. This is astonishing for American law. Why is it? Because Congress has waived sovereign immunity, placing federal agencies, to include DOD, subject to lawsuit as an administrative legal matter, subject to judicial review. And many of them do have citizen suit provisions, but not only federal law, folks, state law, local law, that is part of that umbrella of the respective environmental statute. This is reverse federalism in action. So if you're at a military base, we think of the Supremacy Clause, we think of Article 2, we think of Commander-in-Chief, but all of these domestic environmental laws fully apply to a federal agency to include national security agencies, and not only federal law, but state and local law, as it applies broadly. And there's so many examples where the military or national security actors got this wrong. I'll highlight two. Is the NRDC versus Winter Supreme Court case from 2008, failure to comply with the Marine Mammal Protection Act in NEPA, halted the training of US Navy submarines off of the coast of Hawaii during an active conflict. The border wall. The border wall was presented by President Trump in 2009 under the National Emergencies Act, and it wasn't halted for a fancy constitutional inquiry or a fancy sort of separation of powers inquiry. It was halted for environmental protection. Sierra Club sued the US government under the Endangered Species Act and effectively halted the construction of the border wall. Since the new border wall emergency has been put in place, we'll see how that all works out. But the upshot is this is reverse federalism. So not only do these federal environmental laws apply to agencies, but state and local laws apply as well, and they're very, very closely warranted. So that's my second key takeaway. The scope of the sovereign immunity waiver is really, really breathtaking. But wait, there's more. Extraterritorial application. We know from first year of law school that US law, Congress passes law, it only applies within the United States out to 12 nautical miles unless there's an express extraterritorial application. Many of those T-REX acronyms you saw have an express extraterritorial application. And national security agencies operate around the globe. So many examples, let me highlight you one. This is Marine Corps Air Station Okinawa, Futenma Air Station. I look at this, and as a former aviator, I think to myself, this is in a very urban environment. This is a very challenging place to land a jet at. For 30 to 5 years, the Marine Corps has been trying to go to Hanoko Bay, Camp Schwab, another part of Japan. They have not been able to do so, not because of Japanese law, but because of US domestic environmental law, and this cute creature right here, the Okinawa dugong. The National Historic Preservation Act was used as an extraterritorial matter in the Ninth Circuit to halt the movement of the Marines from Futenma to another part of Japan, and that had essentially halted the movement of that base for decades. So the extraterritorial application has significant national security and broader strategic imperatives. So my third takeaway is unlike many other areas of law, domestic environmental laws, you have to understand the extraterritorial application. We keep relearning this lesson time and time again. Let me shift gears a little bit to international environmental law. It's a little bit of a different story, particularly for international environmental law as it applies to an armed conflict. If you're following Russia-Ukraine, you know that there has been attacks on nuclear power plants. This is Zaporizhzhia, and as well as dams. This is Kharkova, the aftermath of a dam that was struck by Russian forces in 2022. So converse to domestic environmental law, international environmental law, this is my fourth key takeaway, continues to suffer from a lack of accountability and enforcement. The AP1, Additional Protocol 1, couldn't be clearer. It says explicitly in AP1 that an attack on works and installations containing dangerous forces, which includes nuclear power plants, which includes dams, are a violation of the law of war. We've seen a failure of accountability and enforcement. This also relates to the idea of distinction, necessity, proportionality that also applies to environmental protections. Too often, they are afterthoughts during armed conflict. Right now, we're seeing, for example, in Gaza, we have 80% of the trees have been lost in Gaza, 97% of the potable water or the aquifers have been contaminated, and arable farmland has been lost for at least a generation. So the environmental impacts of war continue far, far beyond when that armed conflict ends. Again, my fourth sort of takeaway is that unlike domestic law, international environmental law still has a lot of work to do. Okay, along those lines, there is a long shadow of environmental destruction. We've seen this time and time again, and I'll pick on the United States military because it's close and dear to my home. And this is Agent Orange, 1963 to 1971, massive defoliants of the Vietnam jungle. And at last track, we are seeing, I think, 1.4 million veterans have a disability claim related to this, which says nothing of which the Vietnamese have been faced with the harm from Agent Orange. Oftentimes, there's sort of a short-term desire for mission readiness, for mission reasons to sort of short-circuit environmental protections, but it often has long-term effects. I call this the tyranny of time for environmental law. And I have a close family member, this is very personal to me, who has Agent Orange exposure, who just received 100% disability last year. This is a burn pit in Iraq. We continue to learned these lessons, and we're seeing the exposure to burn pits and other environmental hazards. So again, this is the tyranny of time. This is massive, massive expenditures beyond just the health and safety risks. It's estimated that the PACT Act, which Congress just passed, has a price tag of $300 with $1 billion over the next decade. So my fifth takeaway is then within armed conflict, failure to comply with environmental laws or not consider environmental considerations can impose enormous financial, health, safety risk, and it continues for generations. We're seeing it to this day. Okay, let me shift a little bit from environmental law and protections to climate security and climate change issues. It's a little bit different, but I think it falls in the same umbrella. When I think of climate change, and it's a big issue, for some reason this country is a very political issue, but I think of it very kind of objectively and rationally as kind of falling in three buckets. The first bucket is mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The second is adaptation, which is adjusting the physical environment in response to climate change. And then the third bucket is response, responding to climate disasters and natural disasters both at home and abroad. Okay, so here is mitigation. This is my mitigation slide. This should be rather sobering. So this is annual collective emissions of the world in gigatons per carbon on the y-axis. And on the x-axis is time period out to 2030. Scientists predict, and not just international scientists from the IPCC, but our own scientists from the National Climate Assessment, that we'll start seeing potential tipping points, potential irreversible catastrophic harm, right around 2 degrees Celsius. So we are increasing our greenhouse gas emissions when we need to be decreasing them significantly. So who is this going to stress? Well, it's going to stress the major economies of the world. By the way, the United States has achieved peak emissions 20 years ago. China, India, developing nations continue to increase their emissions. We lack a time machine to go back in time. But it's also going to really stress petrostates. Petrostates like Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Libya, Venezuela, our close friends, right? Petrostates, and this is from the National Intelligence Estimate. This is just a cut and paste from the NIE saying, you can read it, petrostates really fear that they will decrease their greenhouse gas emissions because their economies are heavily reliant upon fossil fuel extraction. So we're seeing sort of this broader destabilization, I think, as these decarbonization efforts unfold. And this is Mr. Putin with Mr. Xi, and Mr. Putin with Mr. Modi. By the way, for the Russia-Ukraine war, we've seen a massive geopolitical energy shift with Russia having new ties with with India and China. The trade between Russia and India is up 300% just on energy alone. So my sixth takeaway is that climate change is a collective action problem. The atmosphere could care less about where the emissions are coming from. And petrostates, particularly Russia, but also Saudi Arabia, Iran, are going to fight these broader decarbonization efforts. Okay, that is just mitigation. I have a rule of thumb, by the way. I'm going to show you an Onion article, which is my favorite news source because so much news is really heavy these days. But my rule of thumb is that when the Onion article has a headline or a picture or a news story, it becomes real life, that's something that I should be concerned about. This is an Onion article from, about a decade ago. So we know from mitigation, there's also adaptation, which is changes in the physical environment. Okay, this is the Onion article headline. Here's some real headlines. 25,000 properties in Louisiana slipping below tidal boundaries by 2050. Many of these states are in the Southeast where I live in Georgia, Florida, North Carolina. This is another headline from First Street Foundation. By the way, First Street Foundation does really interesting work on actuarial science and investment sort of predictions for climate risk. 1/3 of the entire US population is in a risky growth area or a climate abandonment area. And another headline, 7.5 million people are expected to leave their current and emerging areas for the next 30 years. This is starting to translate a little bit into insurance retreat. If you've seen your premiums go up, First Street's informing this. This is having a big impact on just climate adaptation and where do we live, where do we retreat, do we adapt, do we do something else? Closer to home, so what? The national security implications of that, this affects military bases. This is my home, Norfolk Naval Station in Norfolk, Virginia, probably the largest concentration of national security infrastructure probably in the world. Norfolk Naval Station is the largest Navy base in the world. And everything in light blue would be underwater if Hurricane Sandy had hit Norfolk, Virginia as it was expected to hit Norfolk, Virginia. Hurricane Sandy in 2012 was on a direct path to Norfolk, Virginia, sort of shifted to the right to New York and New Jersey at the last moment, but essentially the whole entire military infrastructure in this part of the world would have been underwater. And by the way, 2100 is when we estimate to be 1 meter sea level rise by the end of this century, and that's the dark blue, and quite a bit is going to be underwater there. Okay, so my 7th key takeaway is that climate change is going to force massive domestic migration, and it's going to impact national security infrastructure. By the way, during Q&A or the reception, I'm happy to talk about my work in this area. Response. We will see a rise in defense support to civil authorities as extreme weather, heat, intensity of hurricanes, and frequency of extreme weather events increase. So of course, hurricanes, we've always had them. We've always had heat events. We've always had massive flooding events. But we think that climate change, because the climate scientists tell us they're going to increase in frequency and intensity. This is Pacific Palisades in Los Angeles. Tragically, many people lost their lives. And what's often lost in this is who was responding to these fires. Who was responding to these fires? If you remember, the National Guard, this is California National Guard, responding to recent wildfires out there, and the US Coast Guard, which have sort of our 911 emergency first responders for domestic response. So we are going to see an increase in disasters, and this is really going to stress and test the defense support the civil authority mission. So my 8th key takeaway is that the National Guard and Coast Guard in particular will see an increasing role in natural disaster response. And oh, by the way, we know the National Guard just had the largest domestic military deployment in modern, right? So we're just seeing an increase in humanitarian assistance and disaster response. So, okay, my 9th takeaway, and I'm going along here, I think at a good pace, we're going to see an increase outside the domestic world in international humanitarian assistance and disaster response. We better be ready for that mission. Okay. Well, last takeaway is sort of like, well, where exactly are the canaries in the coal mine? Where are the areas that we really should be looking at for destabilizing national security law, for really being sort of the areas that we should focus on? That's really, really hard. The National Intelligence Estimate has several good reports that I could point you to, but let me highlight sort of 2 areas that I think a lot about. This is a scientific paper, and I read a lot of science in my work here on environment and climate change. Just read this headline of this paper. So climate change is resulting in a physical destabilization. So there are 4 atoll nations, the Maldives, Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Marshall Islands, which the US has a compact with in the South Pacific. They're called Small Island Developing States. So the notion of inhabitability, you don't need to go below the water and be completely underwater. You can have freshwater intrusion by the salt. You can just have lack of farmable areas for farmers to work on. And so we're talking about by mid-century, not 200 years, but 20 years or so, 25 years, 4 nations that are going to be extinct, right? This is inspired some writing of mine, The Specter of Statelessness. We know there's a question this morning from the Montevideo. I love this question. The Montevideo Convention, one of the core characteristics to be a state under international law is you have to have a physical territory. So many of these small island developing states are actually buying territory outside their home. I mean, Australia, Fiji, fill in the blank, but we don't really have a great answer for this, right? We don't have a great answer under international law for this either. And we know just from the climate science, and again, I'm not a climate scientist, but I read this headline and it concerns me. We better have some kind of legal solution for at least these 4 different nations. I'm gonna show you a photo next of the island of Kiribati after a routine rainstorm. This is not an extreme weather event. This is a very poor island in the South Pacific. This is a routine rainstorm. And my question for you, is this habitable? So beyond the small island developing states, let's go up north. Let's go to the Arctic, which you may have been thinking about as another place I might take you to. So the Arctic is warming 3 to 4 times. Initially it was 2 to 3 times, now it's 3 to 4 times the pace of the rest of the world. That's because the polar ice sheets melt, the ocean warms, it builds on itself. It's the albedo effect, right? So the Arctic is very much an area of interest. You just look at the satellites. Even if you don't believe in climate change, you have to say something's going on there, right? With the ice sheets melting, this is between 84 and 2012. If you're an investor in the Suez Canal and Panama Canal, sell your stock. Because the Arctic is gonna be, I think, international navigable way sometime by, I think, 2040 or 2045. This is the sea ice extent of the Arctic. And you can just, again, I'm not a statistician, I don't do math, but I can look at lines and I know that the period is going to be low. So IPCC came out 2 to 3 times faster than the rest of the world. The rest of the world for in terms of the pace of climate change. I think if we're honest about ourselves, and I've been following the Arctic for about 15, 20 years, we don't really know the pace of change up there. I've seen 4 times, I've seen up to 5 times, but the upshot is that it's warming significantly, opening up both possibilities for natural resource extraction, the irony, oil and gas is in the Arctic, and investors are looking at that, as well as sea lanes of traffic, one of them being along the Russian coastline. And Russia has noticed this. And Russia, I think, views themselves culturally as an Arctic nation in a way that maybe we don't. I think if you live in Alaska, you think of yourself as an Arctic nation. The US is an Arctic nation. We have a massive exclusive economic zone. We remember the Arctic Council, but I think culturally, we need to start thinking of ourselves as an Arctic nation just to be responsive to the shifting physical landscape. This is just a map of the Arctic, and I would just highlight there's a couple different transit routes, one through the Northwest Passage, through Canada, and one through Russia. And you can see the exclusive economic zones is very much, about half of that is Russia. So my 10th and final takeaway before I get into Q&A is that climate change is causing a physical destabilization, which I think is resulting in legal instability. In summary, US environmental law is extremely powerful. If you're unsure about environmental law, you have my email, give me a call, I'll walk you through it. It is really, really important. We keep learning time and time again how important it is. It is extremely powerful because of reverse federalism, because of extraterritorial application, and because those broad waivers of sovereign immunity. International environmental law suffers from accountability and what I call the tyranny of time. Climate change will stress and test US military installations and missions, and I also think it's going to destabilize the physical environment with massive security implications. Thank you.
Mark, that was really fascinating. And again, you know, I've heard you speak before, but I always learn something new. And this is really a great summary. Let me start off the thank you Q&As, especially scholars who I might call on, even though they don't have their hands raised. So give them that. Oh, wow, yikes. Emily?
My name is Emily Norris. I'm a 2L at Wake Forest Law. We, in recent years, have seen a shift with things like the Business Roundtable and their statement on purpose for corporations, pledging a commitment to ESG efforts and greater social responsibility. if they follow through on some of these efforts environmentally that they pledge to be dedicated to, do you see that having implications on national security? Especially with corporations who, have a hand in retail where trade is an intimate part of their practice?
So the short answer is I don't know. I don't know, because I think ESG is its own field of law that I'm actually not actively writing on, to be fair. I do think in terms of first movers, I'll think broadly. When I start thinking about who is sort of making changes in response to climate change, it is by far the financial sector and the business sector, right? And we're seeing that with the insurance industry in California, in Florida, in Louisiana. We've seen massive, essentially, retreats from insurance companies from those respective areas based upon just climate risk actuarial science. So on the ESG perspective alone, I'm sorry, I don't have a great answer for you. I don't write actively in the corporate governance area, Emily. It's a fair question, though. But when I think about, is this political or not? Well, businesses are making decisions today based upon actuarial models and climate risk models. If you were in, for example, Florida, and you want to get a new homeowners insurance policy, you will be lucky to get it, and you likely have to go through the California Citizens Insurance, which is state subsidized insurance process. And that would be, when the last time I talked here at Duke Lens, that was just not the case. So we're seeing massive, massive instability in the insurance market. So thank you for the question.
Mark, I'm a little discouraged about the idea of containing climate change through voluntary measures in China and India. Do you think we'll get to the point where geoengineering will be looked at as the answer? Or in my use of course class, I occasionally have students who write on the issue, and there is actually articles out there on this idea of using force against climate violators. What do you think of those two?
Yeah, so I think geoengineering, General, is a very broad term. And I think at one spectrum, I support it wholeheartedly. Direct air capture, maybe some of the efforts around carbon sequestration, things along that. We should be, I think, incentivizing that, maybe even subsidizing business to get involved. And that's sort of low risk, potentially high upside for geoengineering. On the other end of the spectrum, there's like solar radiation in the atmosphere, using solar shields, reflecting the sun, that maybe have impacts that we don't fully understand. But I do think that if you think about that emission slide, I think that people and nations are increasingly going to be looking at geoengineering as a silver bullet. And I just don't think there is a silver bullet for climate change. I think of it more as silver buckshot, right? You need to try a little bit of everything and diversify your approach. So some of those low risk geoengineering strategies I fully support. We actually lack a legal governance system for geoengineering that I think is adequate to address that challenge.
Yes. Do you know if the Bureau of Land Management assists in rescue and aid for fires and floods?
So BLM, yeah. So they would do, BLM has enormous, obviously natural resources, enormous swath. We think of the national parks, but BLM basically owns most of the federal lands. And so they're involved in emergency response, yes ma'am. But I think they're quickly aided by, frankly, the state emergency responders as well as the National Guard. So the BLM is a kind of is not a huge workforce, so they can do what they can. They're often kind of send us help, but there is a certain core force that's there. Yeah, great question. Yeah.
Jacqueline.
Yeah. Hey, Jacqueline. Jacqueline's an Emory student, so.
No, I'm very interested to hear what questions she has for that reason.
Do you think the military's capability to respond and assist in humanitarian efforts will change given the new administration's stance on climate change as seen with the Paris Agreement?
So I don't know. I do know that the U.S. Navy was requested to be involved in some kind of humanitarian assistance once every 2 weeks when I was there. That's just a demand signal that just the U.S. Navy could not keep up with. So right now, in terms of can the U.S. military respond to everything they're asked to do, the answer is no. How this shakes up with the national security priorities, I just don't know. Jacqueline, I haven't seen anything specifically, but you're exactly right. President Trump has announced his withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement. We're still in that agreement for the next year or so. Formal withdrawal doesn't happen for another year or so. I will say this, I think that that's part of the silver buckshot. That, to ask the Conference of Parties, to ask the Paris Climate Agreement, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, to basically be the one-stop shop to solve climate change, I thought is not realistic. I think it could play a role, but just as though with the US withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement, I think there's going to be a bigger role for, frankly, some of these technological investors and things like that to play a role. But I don't think that is, I think that it's not as dire as people think it is. Yeah.
Let's see. Over there? Yeah. I'm sorry. Oh, Isabella. Okay.
Hi, my name's Isabella. I go to William & Mary Law School. As a daughter of Venezuelans, petroleum is so prominent in our everyday lives. I guess my question is, what are some of the incentives or things that can be done to push these like petrostates away from such a reliance on petroleum, especially given that most of them tend to be on the adverse side with the U.S.?
Yeah. When I looked at the National Intelligence Estimate, many of these petrostates are not traditional U.S. allies, right? So in the literature, Isabella, there is a lot of discussion, both internationally and in the United States, about this idea of just transition. How do we transition people away who that's their workforce? They're relying upon those jobs to feed their family, to basically that's their job. And so this is really, really, really hard. I think it's important to have this conversation to acknowledge just how hard it is. In terms of what the U.S. can incentivize to actually do to push to wean petrostates, I think it's really, really challenging. I don't know if there is a really simple answer that's responsive to that. I do think that when you look at the Conference of Parties and you look at the negotiations, most of the pushback is from the petrostates. We start talking about coal transition, and during the Dubai, there was a big shift away from fossil fuels. And so most of the strongest reaction were from places like, frankly, India and China and other sort of petrostates. So, but I don't have, again, what the U.S. can do is has limited tools. Yeah.
Thank you. So first off, thank you for being here. I'm Carter Spawn. I'm from Hampton-Sydney College. I'm one of the undergrads here. So going back to your comments on environmental war and it kind of being overlooked, if we're trying to be environmentally conscious in warfare, what's the line between being conscious of the environment and winning in a kinetic conflict?
Yeah, so first of all, don't violate the law, right? And we've seen Russia violate the law in two specific instances that I provided. Second, I think you want to think about sort of the long-term impacts of these short-term decision-making. I mean, I heard the people who were doing burn pits in Iraq in 2004, 2005, thought there was this part of mission accomplishment and not thinking holistically about the environmental implications. So having environmental as part of the planning process is really, really important. The health and safety impacts on veterans for this alone is really, really unbelievable. Third, core principles of distinction, necessity, proportionality apply to the natural environment. Too often, I think it's overlooked, Carter, in my view, to the detriment, the long-term detriment. The laws of war are based upon, we want to basically end combat as soon as possible, get back to the peacekeeping stage, right? It's kind of a simplification, but once war ends, you have to have a view towards what kind of place are we going to live in afterwards, right? And this is, one of the things that gets too often overlooked. Yeah.
Ironically, back in the day, burn pits were the good news. That's what you were supposed to do because you were getting rid of all these solvents and everything else. Let's get another one. Maybe? Yeah. Sorry.
No problem.
You mentioned a little bit earlier about states that are at risk of, or endangerment due to upcoming climate events. Can you talk a little bit more about the specific national security concerns that might arise, either because these endangered states become extinct because of loss of land, or national security risks that might arise if we start playing with the definition of state in order to be more inclusive of states that have lost land?
Right, so we don't have a good definition of the state. The definition of state and sovereignty that we have, Jimmy, is what we have from the UN Charter, right? Which I think reflects the fact you need to have a physical territory. So I don't know. I mean, the question right now, there's a lot of discussion of what is the role of the Security Council in all of this, right? The Security Council has a host of issues associated with passing anything because of the current makeup of the Security Council, but they have the authority and responsibility to respond to threats to international peace and security, right? So we've seen an expansive, generally speaking, an expansive view of that in the starting around 2000 to address non-traditional threats, terrorism being one of them. You also saw the Ebola, which is a health crisis. They declared that a threat to international peace and security. So I think as an international legal measure, I think the Security Council could potentially play a role. How would that look? I'm not sure exactly, but there's a little bit of appetite potentially to look at non-traditional threats. So, I mean, right now, the nations of Kiribati and Tuvalu aren't wasting their time. They're actually buying land. And if you want to win the Nobel Peace Prize, one of the challenges of the Conference of Parties and is this idea of loss and damage. What are the responsibility of wealthy nations that have emitted enormous amounts of greenhouse gas emissions to aid the poorer nations, right? So we haven't really seen that step up in the way that some people have envisioned as an international legal matter. So I'm very pragmatic that, you know, international law and loss and damage, we only can do so much. Yeah.
Mark, there are some nations like Russia, Canada, Denmark with Greenland that actually benefit from climate change, from the warming climate, because they say that millions of acres of Russia would become arable. Same thing with Canada. Is there any way, and I'm not smart enough to think of it, but is there any way to reconcile those kinds of benefits yet avoid the adverse consequences? Or is it just one of those things that's an either or?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think that Siberia, I think that parts of Greenland are going to be more livable, more habitable. And the president seems to have a very keen interest in Greenland, right? And, you know, and at some level, Greenland, I agree, is going to be of increasing importance for our generation. I don't know, you have to find some kind of legal mechanism, and I'm not smart enough on the top of my head to kind of think through how that might work. But yeah, this idea of loss and damage has been really important to, and really has stalled a lot of international climate efforts, because poor nations, they want to develop their economies, and they're looking at wealthier nations like the United States and Canada and Europe, saying, look, you have a great standard of living. How come we aren't able to develop our economies the same way? And that's really been the holdup. But I don't know if I have a great answer for that specific question. Yeah.
Back there? Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to start with that. Hi, Mark. I'm Major Emily Bobenreath. I teach at the Army JAG School. So taking it back to domestic concerns, you and I have had discussions, not just that the National Guard will be stretched thin, but that Title X soldiers who are called upon when those resources aren't enough for these catastrophic weather events will be called on perhaps more often, more frequently. And my question is, FEMA is a huge piece of that initiation process and getting those requests approved for Title X to be on domestic soil, helping in disaster relief. There's been some headlines about perhaps the reduction of FEMA or perhaps completely dismantling it. And my question for you, sir, is how real do you think that is of becoming a reality? And if it does, what implications does that have for that reliance, future reliance on Title X assistance to getting things back on track?
Right, so it all comes down to funding, right? Exactly right. So FEMA, I think right now is being looked at very, very closely. And I'm maybe just take your question a little bit of a different direction if that's okay. in that there is really a disconnect. I mentioned climate adaptation, sort of where we build, where we live, where we decide to invest, and disaster. And so FEMA comes into place following, quote unquote, a major disaster or an emergency. And most Stafford Act declarations from the state governor to the federal government have historically been approved. And what does that mean? That means that the kind of the FEMA funding starts to flow. We've seen from this administration that that may be stopping a little bit. The 75% of those requests, we'll see how that actually unfolds. But in my mind, you have FEMA funds, which can help, I think, offset some of the deployments. You also have Title 32 funds that has been heavily relied upon for National Guard deployments for these major disaster operations. So we'll see. We'll see. My sense is that the disasters are only going to increase in frequency if you believe the science, as I do. And so I think we do have to have a broader discussion in this country about making some kind of linkage about where we live and disaster response. Because right now, that's just my policy or my, when people say, what's our adaptation policy in this country? And I say, it's really kind of unmanaged retreat. Sometimes we rebuild, sometimes we stay in place, but it's really kind of a cycle of destroy, rebuild, repeat. And we've seen so many cases of, not just on the coast, but in the Kentucky hollers and North Carolina, where there's been 7, 8, 9 disasters in a decade, right? At some point, we have to start thinking about why are we rebuilding in place? So upshot, I think that there's a work to be done to maybe do more, take that FEMA money and maybe do more for adaptation planning up front, but how that actually unfolds this current administration, I guess we'll see.
This is a little unfair to you, but what about state defense forces? You think that states should develop, state defense forces, which are not part of the Guard and so forth, specifically oriented towards wildfires, floods, those, and so you would not try to be dual training an individual to be a combatant, but also in these emergency situations focus on that. Is that anything worth thinking about, or?
Yeah, I guess the question in my mind was that what would they be trained on or be different from the state active duty status, sir? And so it could complement that. But I think, my concern would be sort of unity command, how you fold the SDGs into the state active duty forces. But there's a paper to be written there, I think, right?
I think there is.
Yeah.
I think we're out of time, I'm afraid, but.
Yes, sir.
Mark, fabulous presentation. Super.